At my son's wedding, my seat wasn't missing. It was replaced with a trash can, and the worst part wasn't the smell or the metal lid pressed awkwardly against my knees. It was the sound of laughter that followed when I realized they had done it on purpose, carefully, deliberately, as if humiliation could be wrapped in ribbon and passed off as entertainment. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, holding the small cream-colored place card between my fingers, the one that read, Margaret Collins in elegant calligraphy, now taped neatly to the side of a stainless steel trash bin positioned where my chair should have been, right there in the front row, close enough to see every detail of the ceremony I had helped pay for, close enough for everyone else to see me sitting beside it. Or worse, instead of it, I heard Ashley's voice before I saw her, light and sweet in that practiced way she used when she wanted the room on her side. "Oh, Margaret, it's just a joke. Don't be so dramatic," she said with a soft laugh, as if she were calming a child, and a few guests nearby chuckled along, not loudly, but enough for the moment to settle into something real, something witnessed. I turned slightly, scanning the rows of chairs, the soft white fabric, the floral arrangements I had personally upgraded from standard to premium just 3 weeks ago, the aisle lined with roses flown in from California. All of it pristine, all of it perfect, and yet there I was, the mother of the groom, standing beside a trash can like an afterthought someone forgot to remove before guests arrived. My son Daniel was just a few feet away, adjusting his cufflinks, his reflection caught briefly in the mirrored pillar behind him. He didn't look at me, not once. Not even when Ashley looped her arm through his and leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, whispering something that made him smile. I waited, just a second longer, just long enough to see if he would notice, if he would step forward, if he would say my name the way he used to when he needed something, but he didn't. And in that quiet, suspended moment, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, precise click, like a lock turning into place. I lowered myself into the empty chair beside the trash can, smoothing my navy dress over my knees, the same dress I had worn to Daniel's college graduation, the one he said made me look classy. I folded my hands in my lap and faced forward, ignoring the faint metallic scent beside me, ignoring the sideways glances, the subtle nudges between guests, the quick phones lifted for photos they thought I wouldn't notice. I kept my posture straight, my expression calm, because I had learned a long time ago that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you decide to keep. Even when they try to take everything else. The music began to play, soft strings drifting through the air, and I watched as the wedding planner I had hired with my own money gave a small nod toward the entrance, signaling that everything was ready, everything except, apparently, respect. I let my gaze drift once more toward the front, toward the altar, toward the man I had raised on my own after his father passed, the boy who used to hold my hand in grocery stores and promise he would always take care of me. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel embarrassment. I felt clarity, cold and steady, settling in my chest like something long overdue. They thought this was a joke, something harmless, something I would quietly endure the way I always had. They thought I would sit there beside that trash can and smile for their pictures, pretend not to understand what it meant. But as I sat there, listening to the music swell and the guests turn their attention toward the aisle, I realized something they hadn't, something they couldn't see yet, and that was this. I was the one who had signed the final payment contract for this wedding, and I was the one who hadn't released it yet. I sat there as the ceremony began, hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the soft hum of voices settling into silence, the kind of silence that should have felt sacred, but instead felt staged, like everything around me had been carefully arranged except for me. The officiant stepped forward and welcomed everyone, his voice warm and practiced, thanking the families for their love and support, and I almost smiled at the irony of that word, support, because I could still remember the exact moment 3 months earlier when Daniel had sat across from me at my kitchen table, explaining how expensive everything had become, how venues in this area were booking out a year in advance, how Ashley had her heart set on something elegant, something memorable. I had poured him a cup of coffee and listened without interrupting, watching the way he avoided my eyes, the same way he had just moments ago. And when he finally asked if I could help, just a little, just to make things easier, I had not hesitated. I told him this was his day, that his father would have wanted everything to be perfect, and I wrote the first check that afternoon, then another, and another. The venue, the catering upgrade, the live string quartet, the custom floral installations, each decision framed as something small, something necessary, something that would make the day unforgettable. And I made sure it was. I attended every planning meeting I was invited to, and many I was not. Sitting quietly at the edge of long tables while Ashley spoke confidently about color palettes and seating charts, occasionally glancing at me with that same polite smile she used today, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. There had been moments, small ones, that I had chosen to ignore at the time, like when she reassigned my original seat from the front row to a side table for better balance, or when she laughed lightly and said older guests usually preferred being further away from the music. I told myself she was just trying to manage a complicated event, that weddings brought out stress in people, that it was not personal. But now, sitting where I was, I could see the pattern clearly. Each small adjustment had not been about logistics. It had been about erasing me, slowly, carefully, until the final gesture no longer seemed shocking to anyone but me. The music shifted as Ashley began her walk down the aisle, her dress flowing behind her. In perfect symmetry, the kind of entrance that people remembered, cameras lifting, heads turning, everything aligned exactly as she had planned, and I watched Daniel's face soften as he saw her, watched him take a step forward, his entire world narrowing to the woman walking toward him, and I realized something else then, something heavier than the metal beside me. He had chosen this, not just her, but all of it, every decision, every slight, every moment that led to this one. He had chosen to stand there and let it happen. I inhaled slowly, steady and controlled, the scent of roses mixing faintly with the cold, sterile edge of the bin at my side, and I kept my gaze forward, because there was no reason to look anywhere else now. I had spent years believing that love within a family meant something permanent, something that could not be quietly replaced or rearranged. But as the officiant began speaking about commitment and respect, words that echoed through the carefully decorated space, I understood that respect was never part of what they had planned for me today. And yet, despite everything, I did not move. I did not react. I did not give them the scene they might have expected, because what they did not know, what they could not possibly see from where they stood, smiling under soft lights and surrounded by admiration, was that I had not finished my part in this wedding. Not yet. And I was very careful about when I chose to finish anything the moment the vows began. The room seemed to lean forward in quiet anticipation, every guest drawn into the illusion of something pure and meaningful, and I watched as Daniel took Ashley's hands, his voice steady as he repeated words about loyalty, about respect, about standing beside each other through every season of life. And for a brief second, I wondered if he heard himself, if any part of him felt the weight of those promises against what he had allowed just minutes earlier. But his expression did not change, not even when a light breeze lifted the edge of Ashley's veil and the sunlight caught the diamond on her finger, a ring I had helped him choose, a ring I had partially paid for when he said he wanted something worthy of her. I remember standing in that jewelry store with him, watching the way his eyes lit up when he found the one he liked. And I remember thinking how proud his father would have been, how this moment would have meant everything to him. And now, sitting where I was, I realized how easily meaning could be rewritten when the right people decided. It no longer mattered. The officiant spoke about family, about the people who raised them, supported them, shaped them into who they were today, and there was a small pause, just enough space where acknowledgement might have been placed, a glance, a gesture, something, but nothing came. No mention, no recognition, just a smooth continuation of carefully chosen words that sounded complete while leaving something essential out. I felt the eyes of someone to my left for a moment, a woman I did not know well, her expression uncertain, almost apologetic, before she quickly looked away, as if even that small flicker of sympathy might be seen as stepping out of line. And I understood then that this was not just Ashley's doing. It was something the room had accepted, something easier to go along with than to question, because questioning would require someone to stand up, and standing up would require courage. And courage is often in short supply at events where appearances matter more than truth. I adjusted my hands slightly, feeling the smooth fabric of my dress beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something familiar, something steady, because everything else in that moment felt curated, controlled, as if I were watching a performance rather than a real union. And perhaps that was what it had become, a performance where every role had been assigned in advance, including mine, the silent observer, the one who would sit quietly and not disrupt the narrative they had created. But what they did not understand was that silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it means preparation. Sometimes it means choosing the exact moment when words will matter most. The ceremony moved forward, rings exchanged, smiles shared, the audience responding on cue with soft laughter and gentle applause. And I noticed how effortlessly Ashley commanded attention, how she moved through each moment with confidence, never once glancing in my direction, never once acknowledging the space where I sat, as if removing me from her awareness made it easier to remove me from the story entirely. And Daniel followed her lead, matching her energy, her focus, her complete disregard for anything outside the narrow frame of what they wanted this day to be. I let my gaze drift once more, not to them, but beyond them, to the edge of the reception area where the wedding planner stood near a small table, her tablet in hand, checking details, coordinating timing. And I recognized the subtle tension in her posture, the kind that only appears when something important is still unresolved, something waiting, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper within me. Because while everything in front of them appeared flawless, polished, complete, there was still one element they could not control, one final step that had not yet been taken. And as the officiant pronounced them married and the room filled with applause, I remained exactly where I was. Composed, still, and very aware that the most important part of this day had not happened, yet the applause lingered longer than it needed to, stretching into something almost theatrical as Daniel and Ashley turned to face their guests, smiling as if nothing in the world had ever been out of place. And I watched them walk back down the aisle together, hand in hand, stepping into a future they believed they had carefully constructed, one where every detail had been accounted for, every element controlled. But I had lived long enough to know that control is often an illusion, especially when it depends on the silence of someone who has already begun to see clearly. I remained seated until most of the guests began to rise, chairs shifting, conversations sparking back to life, the soft clinking of glasses already starting somewhere in the distance as the reception prepared to begin, and only then did I stand, smoothing my dress once more, stepping carefully away from the metal bin beside me without acknowledging it, as if it had never been there at all, because in truth, it had already served its purpose, not for them, but for me. It had shown me exactly where I stood in their version of this family, and more importantly, it had shown me where I no longer intended to remain. I moved slowly toward the reception area, my pace measured, my posture steady, passing clusters of guests who offered polite smiles or avoided eye contact altogether, each reaction telling its own quiet story. Some knew, some suspected, and some chose not to see, because it was easier that way, easier to celebrate than to question, easier to laugh than to understand. And as I walked, I caught fragments of conversation drifting through the air, compliments about the ceremony, admiration for the decorations, praise for the elegance of it all. And I thought about how carefully Ashley had curated this image, how much effort she had put into making sure everything appeared flawless, because appearances were everything to her, always had been. I remembered the first time she came to my home, the way she had looked around with that same polite smile, taking in every detail as if she were already deciding what fit into her world and what did not. And I remembered how quickly things began to change after that, small suggestions at first, then decisions made without me. Then entire plans unfolding where my role became less and less visible, until today, when visibility itself had been replaced with something else entirely, something colder, something deliberate. I reached the edge of the reception hall just as the wedding planner approached me, her expression professional but tight around the edges, and she lowered her voice slightly as she spoke, asking if I would be available for a brief confirmation regarding the final payment authorization, and I met her gaze calmly, noting the flicker of relief that crossed her face when I nodded, because she had been waiting for a signal that had not yet been given, and I could see now how carefully everything had been timed, how the celebration depended on that final step being completed, the catering, the staff, the extended hours. All of it hinged on a signature that had not yet been provided, and I felt no urgency, no pressure to rush. Because time, in that moment, was something I controlled, not them. I followed her a few steps toward a small table set discreetly near the back, where a tablet and a folder rested side by side. The final documents prepared, the numbers already agreed upon, the expectations already set, and as I looked down at the screen, I could hear the distant sound of laughter growing louder as guests settled into the reception, unaware that something essential remained unfinished, something that could not be undone once completed, and I let my fingers rest lightly against the edge of the table, not reaching for the stylus just yet, because decisions, real decisions, are not made in haste, they are made with clarity, and I had never felt clearer than I did in that moment. The planner stepped slightly to the side, giving me space, as if she understood that this was not just a routine confirmation, and I could feel her attention lingering without being intrusive, waiting for a signal that would allow everything else to proceed. I glanced once more at the screen in front of me, the total amount displayed clearly, every detail itemized, every upgrade accounted for, from the imported roses to the extended reception hours, all of it resting behind a single authorization that had not yet been completed, and I thought about how many times over the past few months I had been asked to trust the process, to go along with decisions, to believe that everything was being handled with care, when in reality, each step had quietly pushed me further out of the picture. I rested my hand lightly on the table, not reaching for the stylus. Not yet, because there was still something I needed to confirm, something I had already anticipated long before this moment arrived. I turned my head slightly and asked the planner, in a calm and even tone, whether the final authorization would immediately release all remaining services for the evening, and she nodded, explaining that once the payment was confirmed, everything would proceed without interruption, the full dinner service, the live band, the additional hours that had been specially requested, and I thanked her softly, acknowledging the professionalism in her voice, before asking one more question, whether there was a grace period if the authorization was delayed, and this time, she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before explaining that without confirmation, certain services would remain on hold, not canceled, but not guaranteed either, and that small distinction settled into place exactly where I expected it to. I gave a slight nod, absorbing the information without reacting, and then I reached into my purse, retrieving my phone with a steady hand, scrolling through a short list of contacts until I found the one I needed, the number saved months ago when I had first insisted on being directly involved in the financial arrangements. I stepped a few feet away, just enough to create a private space without drawing attention, and placed the call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, the venue coordinator, polite and efficient, and I introduced myself calmly, confirming my identity before asking a simple question about the status of the event without final authorization. And the answer came exactly as expected, respectful, cautious, but clear. Without the completed release, certain elements would remain pending, including premium services that required full confirmation. I thanked him, ended the call, and returned to the table without any change in my expression, because there was no need for one. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should. I picked up the stylus then, holding it between my fingers, feeling its weight, its simplicity, how something so small could finalize something so large, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what they expected from me. A quick signature, a quiet compliance, the final piece falling into place exactly as they had planned. But expectation is not reality, and reality, I had learned, belongs to the person who chooses when to act. I set the stylus back down gently beside the tablet, not with hesitation, but with intention, and I turned to the planner, offering a composed smile as I told her that I would need a few more minutes before completing the authorization. Her expression shifted, subtle but noticeable, a flicker of concern quickly masked by professionalism, and she nodded, assuring me that she would remain nearby, ready whenever I was. And as she stepped away, I lifted my gaze toward the reception floor, where laughter had already begun to build, glasses raised, music preparing to start, and I watched as Daniel and Ashley moved among their guests, accepting congratulations, smiling effortlessly, unaware that the foundation beneath their perfect evening was still waiting for one final decision, a decision that, for the first time that day, was entirely mine. I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting the sounds of the reception grow fuller, louder, more confident. As if the entire evening had already secured its success without question, glasses clinked somewhere near the bar. A burst of laughter followed, and the first notes of music began to rise from the band as they tested their instruments, all of it moving forward on the assumption that everything had been settled, that nothing remained uncertain, and I watched as Daniel guided Ashley toward the center of the room, their hands still linked, their smiles effortless, accepting congratulations as though the day had unfolded exactly as it should, and perhaps in their minds, it had. I noticed the way Ashley leaned slightly toward a group of guests. Her voice animated, her gestures confident, completely at ease in a space she believed she controlled, and Daniel stood beside her, nodding, smiling, playing his part just as carefully, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember a different version of him, one that existed years ago. A boy who would have noticed if I was missing, who would have asked where I was, who would have made space for me without hesitation, but that version had been replaced, quietly, gradually, by someone who understood the value of appearances more than the weight of loyalty. I took a slow breath and began to walk along the edge of the reception floor, not toward them, but past them, moving with purpose but without urgency, because urgency suggests emotion, and emotion was no longer guiding me. Clarity was. I passed a group of guests who lowered their voices slightly as I approached, their conversations shifting in subtle ways that did not need to be explained, and I could feel the awareness in the room beginning to shift. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough to suggest that something was no longer aligning perfectly. I reached a small table near the side where place settings had been arranged for select guests, and I noticed the absence immediately. No card with my name, no chair reserved. Nothing to indicate that I had ever been expected to sit among them, and I let my gaze rest there for a second longer than necessary, not in surprise, but in confirmation, because it matched everything else I had already seen, everything else I had already understood. I turned away without comment and continued walking, eventually stopping near the planner again, who looked at me with a composed expression that carried just a hint of anticipation, as if she were waiting for the moment when everything would finally move forward. And I met her gaze with the same calm steadiness I had carried all afternoon, informing her quietly that I would not be completing the authorization at this time. Her reaction was immediate, but controlled, a slight tightening around her eyes, a careful pause before she responded, explaining that without the final confirmation, certain premium services might not proceed as scheduled, and I nodded, acknowledging her words without resistance, because I already knew. I had made sure I knew. I thanked her again for her professionalism and assured her that she should continue with whatever was possible under the current arrangements, and then I stepped back, giving her the space she needed to do her job. As I turned, I noticed a subtle change beginning to ripple through the room, small at first, barely noticeable, a server pausing briefly near the catering station, a band member glancing toward the planner for direction, a quiet exchange between two staff members that ended with a nod and a shift in movement. And I realized that the illusion was beginning to thin, not collapse, not yet, but shift just enough to reveal that something essential had not been secured. I moved toward the outer edge of the room again, positioning myself where I could observe without being at the center, and I watched as Daniel looked around briefly, his expression flickering with something uncertain, as if he had just sensed a change he could not yet define, and Ashley followed his gaze a moment later, her smile tightening slightly before she quickly redirected her attention back to the guests in front of her, maintaining control, maintaining the image, but I could see it now. The first crack, small, controlled, but real, and I remained exactly where I was, composed, silent, and completely aware that what they had dismissed as a joke had already begun to cost them more than they understood. The shift became impossible to ignore once the first tray of champagne failed to arrive on time. It was a small thing, something most guests would not question at first, but in a room built on precision, small things stand out. I watched as one of the servers paused near the bar, glancing toward the planner again, waiting for direction that did not come as quickly as it should have, and the band, which had been preparing to begin the first dance, hesitated just long enough to create a ripple of uncertainty across the floor. Daniel noticed it this time. I could see it in the way his posture stiffened slightly, the way his eyes moved past Ashley for a brief second, searching for something out of place, and Ashley followed that same instinct a moment later, her smile holding, but thinner now, more controlled, as if she were adjusting to something she had not anticipated. I remained where I was, just beyond the main flow of attention, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my expression unchanged, because there was no need to move closer, no need to insert myself into the moment. The moment would come to me on its own. It always does when the foundation beneath it is no longer secure. I watched as the planner approached them, her steps careful, her tone low, and though I could not hear the exact words, I could read the shift in their faces, Daniel's confusion sharpening into concern, Ashley's confidence tightening into something more rigid, less natural. She nodded quickly, saying something in response, something meant to maintain control, but control requires certainty, and certainty had already begun to slip. A few guests nearby exchanged glances, subtle at first, but noticeable, the kind of quiet communication that spreads faster than any announcement. People sense when something is not right, even when they do not yet know what it is. And the energy of the room began to change, not dramatically, not with chaos, but with a quiet hesitation. Conversations paused mid-sentence, laughter softened, attention shifting toward the center where the couple stood, waiting for the next moment that was not arriving as expected. Daniel turned his head then, scanning the room again, and this time his eyes found me, just for a second, just long enough for recognition to settle in, and I held his gaze without expression, without accusation, simply present, and in that brief exchange, I saw something flicker in his expression, something that had not been there before, not guilt, not fully, but awareness. The beginning of understanding that something important had been overlooked. Ashley noticed his distraction and followed his line of sight, her eyes landing on me with a sharpness that had been carefully hidden until now. And for the first time that day, her composure shifted, not broken, but strained, as if she were recalculating in real time, adjusting to variables she had not accounted for. She said something to Daniel, her tone quick, controlled, and he nodded, though less certain now. And I could see the question forming behind his eyes, the one he had not needed to ask before, the one he was only now beginning to understand. I did not move, I did not speak, because there was no need to explain what they were already starting to feel, the absence of something they had assumed would always be there, the quiet support they had taken for granted. And as the seconds stretched just a little longer than they should have, as the music delayed, as the staff waited, as the room held its breath in a way no one could quite name, I felt that same steady clarity settle deeper within me. Because this was no longer about what had been done to me, it was about what had been revealed to them. And sometimes, the most powerful response is not to confront, not to argue, but simply to allow the consequences of a decision to arrive, exactly as they were meant. To the pause stretched just long enough to turn discomfort into attention, and attention into quiet suspicion. The kind that moves through a room without needing words. I saw it in the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, in the way guests shifted slightly in their seats, no longer fully relaxed, no longer certain of what was supposed to happen next. The band remained still, instruments in hand, waiting for a signal that had not been given, and the servers hovered at the edges, trays prepared but unmoving, as if the entire evening had reached a point where it could not continue. Without something that was no longer guaranteed. Daniel stepped away from Ashley then. Just a single step, but enough to break the symmetry they had maintained all day. His eyes scanning the room again before settling on me with a clarity that had not been there before. And this time he did not look away immediately. This time he started to walk toward me. Slowly at first, then with more intention, weaving through the guests who instinctively made space for him. Sensing that something was unfolding that they did not yet understand. Ashley followed a second later, her expression composed but sharpened, the careful balance of her demeanor beginning to show strain. And when they reached me, Daniel spoke first, his voice lower than usual, controlled, but carrying a tension that had not been there earlier, asking if everything was all right, as if the answer might still be something simple, something easily resolved. I met his gaze without hesitation, my expression calm, and I told him that everything was proceeding exactly as expected, and for a moment, he did not understand. I could see it in the slight furrow of his brow, the pause before he spoke again, asking what I meant, and Ashley stepped in then, her tone softer, almost conciliatory, suggesting that if there had been any misunderstanding earlier, it had only been meant in good humor, that no one intended to cause discomfort. And there it was again, the same careful phrasing, the same dismissal wrapped in politeness, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her words to settle into the space between us, before responding in the same measured tone I had used all day, explaining that I had not been uncomfortable, that I had simply made a decision, and that decision had not yet changed. Daniel's expression shifted then, the realization beginning to take shape, the connection forming between what he was seeing now and what had been done earlier, and he asked, more directly this time, whether the final authorization had been completed, and I held his gaze as I answered, no, not yet. And the silence that followed was different from the others that had filled the room that day. This one was sharper, more defined, because it carried understanding. Ashley's composure tightened further, her voice losing a fraction of its warmth as she explained that the event could not continue properly without that step, that everything had been arranged based on that expectation, and I nodded, acknowledging her statement without disagreement. Because she was correct, everything had been arranged, everything except respect, and I let that thought remain unspoken as I added, calmly, that arrangements often depend on mutual consideration, and that consideration had not been part of what I experienced earlier. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized from years ago when he was trying to process something he had not anticipated, and for the first time, he did not look at Ashley for guidance. He looked at me, directly, as if trying to understand where the line had been drawn, and I did not move. I did not soften, because clarity does not require explanation. It requires recognition, and as the room around us remained suspended in quiet anticipation, I could see that recognition finally beginning to take hold, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change everything that came next. Daniel did not speak immediately after that, and in that silence I could see the exact moment everything settled into place for him. Not as an argument, not as a confrontation, but as a simple understanding that something had shifted beyond his control. He glanced briefly toward Ashley, as if searching for a solution that had always been there before, but this time her expression offered none, only a tight composure that no longer carried the same certainty. The room around us remained quiet in a way that felt deliberate now, as if the guests had collectively decided to wait, to observe, to see how this would resolve without drawing attention to the fact that they were watching, and I could feel that awareness pressing gently at the edges of the moment, not intrusive, but present. Daniel looked back at me then, his voice softer, stripped of the confidence it had carried earlier in the day, and he asked what I wanted, not in frustration, but in a way that suggested he was trying to understand the terms of something he had not realized was negotiable. I considered the question for a brief second, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted him to hear it clearly, without confusion, without room for misinterpretation, and I told him that what I wanted had never changed. It was never complicated. It was never unreasonable. I wanted to be treated with the same basic respect that he had just promised to uphold in front of everyone. And the simplicity of that seemed to settle more heavily than anything else I could have said. Ashley shifted beside him, her voice entering the space again, controlled but sharper now, suggesting that this was not the time for discussions like this, that the day should not be disrupted over something that had already been explained as harmless. And there it was again, the same framing, the same dismissal, and I turned my gaze to her briefly, meeting her eyes without challenge, simply acknowledging her presence in the moment before returning my attention to Daniel, because this was not about her anymore, not entirely. It was about the choice he was making in real time, the line he would either see or continue to ignore. I told him calmly that I had not disrupted anything, that everything was proceeding exactly as arranged, just not in the way they had assumed, and that the next step was his, not mine, because respect is not something that can be requested after the fact. It is something that is shown in the moment it matters. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as if the weight of the situation had finally settled onto him fully, and he nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, a small, quiet acknowledgement that he understood more than he had before, and without saying anything further, he turned, taking a step back toward Ashley, toward the center of the room, where everything was still waiting, still paused, still incomplete, and I watched as he spoke quietly to the planner, his tone different now, less certain, more measured, asking what needed to be done to move forward, and the planner responded with the same professionalism she had maintained throughout, explaining the requirements, the conditions, the reality of the situation without embellishment, and for the first time that day, the illusion of control shifted completely, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden reactions, but with a quiet transfer of understanding, and I remained where I was, composed, still, knowing that whatever happened next would not be decided by expectation, or assumption, or dismissal, but by the choices they were now forced to make. And as the first notes of music finally began to rise again, tentative at first, testing whether the moment could continue, I understood that the outcome had already been determined, not by what I said, but by what they had chosen to see, and what they had chosen to ignore.